It was a humid Tuesday evening when Eloise Grant walked into the emergency room with her daughter, Nina. Her chest had been tight all afternoon, the kind of pressure that made her pause between words. She'd taken 2 aspirin, but the ache only grew heavier, spreading up her left arm like a slow current. "Let's get you checked," Nina said, slipping a hand under her mother's elbow. The automatic doors whooshed open, letting out a blast of cold, sterile air. The waiting room was half full, families whispering, children fidgeting, a man holding his stomach in one corner. At the intake desk, a nurse in blue scrubs smiled briefly. "Name?" "Eloise Grant," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Date of birth?" "August 6, 1949. The nurse nodded, typing fast. "What brings you in tonight?" "Chest pain, short of breath." The nurse's eyes flicked up. "Okay, on a scale of 1 to 10. "Maybe 7, Eloise said. Nina frowned. "7? Mama, it's more like 9. The nurse gave a polite nod and said, "All right, have a seat. Someone will call you shortly." Eloise blinked. "That's it?" The nurse smiled. "The system will rank your case. If it's urgent, you'll be called right away." Nina looked at the monitor above the desk, a large screen showing patient initials and colored bars. Next to EG appeared a yellow line with the words, "Low priority, non-responsive." "What does that mean?" Nina asked. The nurse glanced up briefly. "It's just the triage code, ma'am." "But my mother's talking right now," Nina said. "She just told you her name." The nurse shrugged gently. "The system reads the notes and vital signs together. It might have picked up something from the intake entry. She'll be fine." They found 2 seats near the back. Eloise leaned forward, one hand pressed to her chest. "Breathe slow," Nina said, rubbing her back. "They'll call you soon." Across the room, a young man holding an ice pack over his wrist was called before them. Then a teenage girl with a sprained ankle. Then another patient who'd come in after them. Nina's jaw tightened. How are they all getting called first? Her mother tried to smile. Maybe they're just faster at typing. Nina stood and walked back to the desk. "Excuse me, my mother's having chest pain. It's getting worse. Can someone check her again?" The clerk looked up from her screen. "It says here her oxygen's normal and her heart rate's fine." "Did you check it recently?" Nina asked. "No, but the system hasn't flagged any change." "The system?" Nina repeated. "You mean no one's actually looked at her?" The clerk's voice softened. "I understand your concern, but we follow the triage score. She's marked as stable." Nina glanced at the monitor again. The yellow bar still blinked. Low priority, non-responsive. Her throat tightened. "Non-responsive means she can't speak. She's right there talking to you." "I know," the clerk said quietly. "Sometimes the computer reads that wrong if the nurse marked delayed speech or low energy." "Low energy?" Nina said. "She's 74 and gasping for air, not lazy." Back in her seat, Eloise's skin looked paler. "Still waiting?" she murmured. Nina nodded. "They said you're stable." Eloise smiled faintly. "Well, that's one opinion." Her chest rose and fell with shallow rhythm. Sweat glistened along her hairline. A man across the aisle offered his bottle of water. "You sure she shouldn't be back there?" "She should," Nina said, "but the screen says otherwise." 30 minutes passed, then 45. When Eloise shifted in her chair, a low groan escaped her lips. Nina jumped up. "Mom, are you okay?" Eloise nodded weakly, whispering, "Feels heavier now." Nina waved down a nurse walking past. "Please, my mother needs help right now." The nurse scanned her bracelet, frowned, and looked at the tablet. "Oh, she's flagged as low priority. Let me find someone to reassess." Nina snapped. "Forget the flag. Look at her." The nurse hesitated, then grabbed a wheelchair. "All right, let's check her vitals again." As they wheeled her to a side room, Eloise whispered, "It's strange. The machine says I'm not urgent, but my heart feels like it's running out of time." Nina squeezed her hand. "Then we'll make sure someone listens to you, not it." In a world built on speed and data, urgency had become a number. A living woman sat in pain while a screen declared her non-responsive. The computer didn't hear the tremor in her breath, only the silence it mistook for calm. That night, as Eloise drifted in and out of half-sleep under the fluorescent hum, Nina whispered to herself, "If they won't hear her heartbeat, I'll make them." Next, Nina discovers how the ER triage system works and why her mother's slow answers and wrong readings convinced a computer that she could wait. The next morning, while Eloise rested in a curtained corner of the ER, Nina sat by her bedside scrolling through her phone. She was still trying to understand how a computer could look at her mother, pale, sweating, struggling to breathe, and decide she wasn't urgent. When the charge nurse stopped by to check the monitors, Nina asked, "Can you explain how that triage score works, the one that called my mother low priority?" The nurse hesitated. "You really want to know?" "Yes," Nina said, "like step by step. Pretend I don't speak hospital." The nurse nodded and sat down. "All right, most hospitals use something called an automated triage system. It reads data from the moment you check in, your symptoms, your vital signs, even notes the intake nurse types." "So the computer decides before a doctor even looks?" Nina asked. "In a way," the nurse said. "It's supposed to help us sort patients faster. The system scans keywords like chest pain or shortness of breath and compares them to your vitals. Then it calculates a risk score, high, medium, or low." Nina frowned. "That sounds logical, but what makes it think someone's non-responsive when they're talking?" The nurse sighed. "It looks for patterns, typing delays, incomplete sentences, pauses in speech that the intake nurse logs in real time. If the nurse wrote, 'Patient slow to answer' or 'appears tired,' the model sometimes reads that as non-responsive." Nina stared at her. "You're saying one line in a computer could decide if she gets seen in 5 minutes or 50? The nurse nodded quietly. "That's exactly it." When the doctor finally arrived to run tests, Nina followed him into the hallway. "Doctor, why are we trusting a program to tell us who's sickest?" He rubbed his eyes. "Because the ER sees 200 people a night. The system helps us manage chaos." "But it made a mistake," Nina said. "My mother was sitting right there, breathing hard." The doctor nodded. "The software isn't perfect. It relies on numbers, oxygen, pulse, blood pressure. If those read normal, the computer assumes stability. But sometimes numbers lie." Nina crossed her arms. "So the machine looked at her stats and said, 'She's fine,' even while her heart was begging for help?" "Exactly," he said softly. "That's why human review matters. We're supposed to override when something doesn't feel right. But short staffing means we depend on the score more than we should." Later, Nina noticed a paperclip to her mother's chart, triage summary. It listed dozens of data points. Heart rate, 82. Oxygen saturation, 98%. Blood pressure, 128/74. Respiratory rate, 14. Speech latency, slowed response. Arrival method, walk-in, no ambulance. Arrival time, 19:45, after hours. And at the bottom, category, low priority, non-responsive. Nina traced the line with her finger. So, because she walked in on her own and didn't come by ambulance, that counted against her too? The nurse returned, nodding. "The system weighs arrival method and timing. People who come by ambulance or during peak hours get higher scores, more eyes watching." "That's not medicine," Nina said quietly. "That's math." When the nurse left, Eloise looked up weakly. "You finding out what all this means?" "Yes," Nina said softly. "Apparently, you were too polite to get help." Eloise managed a small chuckle. "I've been polite my whole life. Never thought it turned into a diagnosis." That afternoon, Nina pulled up an article on her phone titled "Predictive Triage and Emergency Efficiency." The first line read, "Automated risk scoring reduces doctor workload and ensures equitable patient flow."
she snorted. Equitable, my foot. Further down, a quote from a hospital administrator. The model prioritizes high-cost emergencies to optimize outcomes and resource allocation. Nina murmured, so it saves money by ranking who looks expensive. Eloise smiled faintly. Guess I wasn't pricey enough. Before leaving for the night, the nurse stopped by again. You asked earlier why it called your mom non-responsive, she said. I checked the record. It flagged that because the intake note said, patient slow to answer, short phrases. That's all it took. Nina clenched her fists. She was catching her breath, not ignoring them. I know, the nurse said softly. That's the problem. The machine can read text, but not tone.
Emergency rooms built these systems to save time, but time is only useful if it saves lives. The algorithm didn't hear the wheeze between Eloise's words or the tremor in her hands. It just saw silence and called it safety. That night, Nina wrote in her notebook, "The system measured what it could see, not what it should have heard." It counted her pauses, but not her pain. She closed the notebook and whispered, "Tomorrow, we find out what else it got wrong." By morning, Eloise's breathing had eased a little, but the ache in her chest lingered like a warning. Nina sat beside her, staring at the monitor by the bed. Green numbers flashing, steady beeps filling the silence. "They finally ran the blood test," Eloise murmured. "Took 'em long enough." Nina nodded. "They said the troponin level's high. That means your heart's been under stress." Eloise sighed. Guess the machine didn't catch that either. Later that morning, a resident came by holding a tablet. He smiled politely. "Good news. We'll keep you overnight for observation. No heart attack, but we'll watch your vitals." Nina frowned. Why was she low priority last night? She could have been dying in that chair. He glanced at the tablet. Her vitals looked fine on paper. The algorithm didn't flag anything urgent. "Because it was wrong," Nina said. "Her oxygen reading was high because her hands were cold. The pulse clip didn't pick up right." The resident nodded, hesitant. "It happens. The system depends on good input. One bad sensor can change everything." "And the non-responsive tag?" Nina asked. He looked uncomfortable. "That came from the intake notes. It's automatic." "Automatic doesn't mean accurate," she shot back. That afternoon, Nina requested to see her mother's full triage report. The nurse printed a copy and handed it over quietly. The first page was a checklist of inputs, tiny pieces of data that told a big, incomplete story. Speech latency, marked as delayed. Tone, flat. Arrival method, walk-in, no assistance. Past ER visits, 2 in 18 months, both after hours. Prior departures, left without full discharge once. And at the bottom, under algorithm notes, one line made Nina's blood boil. Patient exhibits compliance, but low engagement, likely anxiety rather than cardiac distress. She stared at it, her jaw tight. They turned politeness into a symptom. Eloise looked up from her bed. "So now I'm anxious and invisible?" Nina forced a smile. "Not invisible anymore." She marched down to the nurse's station, report in hand. "Who writes these notes? Who tells the computer to assume anxiety instead of danger?" The charge nurse sighed. "Nobody tells it. The model learns from patterns in old data." "What kind of data?" "Historical ER cases, thousands of them. It looks for trends, who came in, who was admitted, who wasn't." Nina's eyes narrowed. "So if people like my mother were often sent home, the system learns that they should be sent home?" The nurse nodded reluctantly. "That's how bias sneaks in." When she returned to her mother's room, Eloise was watching the local news on the small TV mounted to the wall. A headline scrolled across the bottom. "AI in emergency care, the future of fairness or a hidden risk?" Eloise chuckled weakly. "They're just now asking that?" Nina sat down beside her. "They built a system that studies the past to predict the future,
But the past wasn't fair to begin with. Her mother reached for her hand. Baby, fairness has to be taught, even to machines. That evening, the cardiologist stopped by to review her chart. Good thing you insisted she stay, he said. Her EKG shows early signs of ischemia, reduced blood flow. Another hour of waiting, and this could have gone bad. Nina nodded, her voice shaking. The computer thought she could wait. The doctor sighed. Computers don't see faces. They see numbers, and numbers can lie. Eloise smiled faintly. Then maybe it's time we start teaching them some manners. The system wasn't malicious. It was obedient, faithfully repeating every wrong assumption that built it. It learned that calm meant safe, that politeness meant stable, that older black women rarely crashed, until one nearly did. The model didn't miscalculate. It misread humanity. That night, as her mother slept, Nina wrote in her notebook. The computer didn't see her breath, only the gaps between her words. It didn't hear fear. It heard patience and called it permission to wait. She closed the book and whispered, "Tomorrow, they'll hear me loud and clear." Next, Nina challenges hospital policy itself and learns that every delay, every mistaken tag traces back to one contract built to save money, not lives.
By morning, Nina's patience had run dry. Her mother was stable now, but the thought of what might have happened if she hadn't pushed still made her shake. She stood at the nurse's station holding a copy of the triage report. "I want to talk to whoever manages this system," she said firmly. The charge nurse looked apologetic. "That would be our clinical operations director. He's upstairs in administration." "Then I'll go there." "Ms. Grant, please." But Nina was already walking down the hallway. The director's office sat behind frosted glass on the hospital's 4th floor. He was a tall man in a gray suit, calm, professional, and clearly used to complaints. "Miss Grant," he said, motioning to a chair, "I understand you have concerns about our triage program." "Concerns?" she said, sitting down. "My mother was nearly sent home with a heart attack because your program thought she could wait." He folded his hands. "The triage AI follows national standards. It's been tested to reduce overcrowding. And how many people have to wait too long before you test compassion?" He exhaled. "We rely on data, not guesswork." Nina slid the report across the desk. "Then look at your data. Non-responsive, anxious, low engagement, all because she talked slow and didn't come by ambulance. That's not data, that's dismissal." The director scanned the page and frowned slightly. "Those fields are auto-generated. Nurses can override them." "She tried," Nina said, "but she told me the policy says you can't move someone up without a system prompt." He nodded slowly. "That's correct. Manual overrides require a second signature for liability reasons." Nina leaned forward. "Liability for who? The hospital or the patient?" "The hospital," he admitted. She shook her head. "So you built a system to protect paperwork, not people." Meanwhile, downstairs, Eloise watched the morning shift roll in. New nurses, new patients, the same cold fluorescent light. She overheard 2 staff members chatting near her curtain. "Another complaint about the AI," one said. "That's the 3rd this week." "Yeah," the other replied, "but admin says it saves millions in ER costs. Less doctor time per patient." Their words, not mine. Eloise closed her eyes, whispering a quiet prayer. Upstairs, the conversation grew tense. "Miss Grant," the director said, "I assure you the system is designed to assist, not replace clinical judgment." "Then why does everyone act like it's gospel?" Nina asked. "If a nurse sees a patient struggling, she shouldn't need permission from a machine to care." He hesitated. "You're not wrong, but the model was built to minimize human error." "Funny," Nina said. "The only error here was trusting it too much." That afternoon, the hospital's risk management officer joined the meeting. She spoke in polished phrases. Workflow efficiency, optimization, predictive insight. Nina cut her off. My mother is not a workflow. She's a person who almost died because someone didn't look up from a screen. The woman blinked, uncomfortable. We'll review the incident. Review it? Nina said. You'll review it until someone else's mother runs out of time. Hours later, Nina returned to her mother's room. Eloise smiled faintly. How'd it go, baby? They said they'll review it, Nina said bitterly. Eloise nodded. That's hospital talk for file it and forget it. Not this time, Nina said. They don't get to forget your name. The next day, a nurse pulled Nina aside. You didn't hear this from me, she whispered, but staff are scared to override the AI. Every time they do, the system flags them for review, makes it look like they slowed down care. Nina's eyes widened. So they're punished for thinking? The nurse nodded. That's why most just let the computer decide. Later that week, Nina received an email from a friend who worked in another hospital. Attached was a slide from a corporate training deck. Reduce over-triage equals reduce cost. Underneath, smaller text read, AI-assisted triage lowered ER expenses by 19% in low acuity groups. Nina whispered, Low acuity? That's code for not expensive to lose. That evening, she sat beside her mother's bed again. Eloise reached over and squeezed her hand. You've been fighting for me nonstop. I'm fighting for everyone who's still waiting in that lobby, Nina said quietly. Eloise smiled. Then make sure they hear you. When policy meets profit, compassion becomes optional. The triage system wasn't designed to ignore patients like Eloise. It was designed to save time. But in medicine, time is what life is made of. That night, Nina opened her notebook again. They call it efficiency. I call it distance. Every layer of automation is another wall between a patient and their pulse. She set down her pen and whispered, Tomorrow, I'm finding out who built this thing. Next, Nina follows the paper trail, from the hospital's boardroom to the company that sold them the system and the hidden promise behind every line. Less time per patient, lower cost per visit. Nina started early the next morning, armed with coffee and determination. She had learned something from her mother's ordeal. Systems leave footprints. All she had to do was follow them. She filed a request under the state's Right to Information law, asking for every document related to the hospital's triage software. Most people never asked. Nina wasn't most people. 2 days later, a folder appeared in her inbox marked Confidential, Vital Rank Deployment Documents. Vital Rank? That was the name of the system. Inside, she found glossy marketing slides and training notes filled with phrases that made her stomach twist. Reduce provider burnout. Automate risk scoring for greater throughput. Eliminate human bottlenecks. One bullet point glowed in bold yellow. Average time per patient reduced by 23%. She muttered, Yeah, and that 23% could have been my mother's heartbeat. Buried deeper in the documents was something worse, a table labeled Predictive Inputs and Weight Factors. She read the list aloud. Speech latency, negative 1.2 points. Late evening arrival, negative 0.5 points. Walk-in, no transport, negative 0.7 points. Past ER discharge without admission, negative 1.0 points. Residents in high variance zips, negative 0.6 points. At the bottom, composite score under 4.0 equals low priority, auto queue. Nina stared at the screen. So it punished her for being poor, polite, and punctual. That afternoon, she printed everything and drove straight to the Daily Ledger office, where Tasha, the same reporter who'd helped with the pharmacy case months earlier, was waiting. When Nina laid the papers on the desk, Tasha whistled softly.
They're waiting zip codes. Yup, Nina said, and late-night arrivals, because if you come from the wrong neighborhood or show up after dark, they think you're less reliable. Tasha leaned back. That's not efficiency. That's discrimination written in code. Nina nodded, and they're proud of it. They brag about saving money on non-critical cases, but those cases have faces. A week later, the story hit the front page. The non-responsive tag, how ER algorithms decide who waits to breathe. The article quoted Nina, the hospital whistleblowers, and excerpts from Vital Rank's internal documentation. One line drew the most attention. Patients from high-variance zip codes are statistically more likely to misuse ER resources. Bernice saw the headline on the breakfast table and chuckled softly. Misuse ER resources? Honey, I paid for those resources all my life. Nina smiled. They forgot that hospitals don't have customers, they have people. Within days, the hospital's phone lines were flooded. Families from all over the state called with eerily similar stories. Chest pain, asthma, infections, all labeled low priority by the same system. A retired nurse emailed Tasha, I've seen it flag elderly patients as non-responsive just for speaking slowly. We're told to trust the computer. Another wrote, we stopped overriding the AI because every time we did, management called us inefficient. The pattern was clear. The machine wasn't broken. It was behaving exactly as designed. The following week, a press conference was held. The hospital's CEO stood at the podium reading from a prepared statement. Our triage system has improved efficiency and patient flow, he said. While we regret any isolated errors, the data shows overall improvement. A reporter raised a hand. How many patients were downgraded incorrectly? The CEO hesitated. We're reviewing that. Tasha shouted from the crowd, would you call it a coincidence that most of them were elderly Black women? The room fell silent. That night, Nina sat on her mother's porch, the sound of crickets filling the quiet. You did it again, Eloise said, sipping tea. You stirred up a hornet's nest. Nina smiled faintly. Good. Maybe next time they'll think twice before calling someone non-responsive. Eloise laughed softly. You know, when I was a teacher, I used to say silence doesn't mean absence. Looks like the world still needs that lesson. The paper trail never lies. It told a story of quiet numbers and loud injustice, where efficiency became an excuse and accuracy a casualty. Behind every non-responsive tag was a human being waiting to be heard. That night, Nina wrote in her notebook, they called it optimization. I call it omission. The machine didn't lose empathy. It was never programmed to have any. She closed the book and whispered, tomorrow we find everyone else they labeled silent. Next, the story spreads from one hospital to hundreds as nurses, families, and advocates unite to demand change. And for the first time, lawmakers begin to ask the same question Nina did. What does fairness sound like in a world that listens to data instead of people? By the end of the week, the phones at the Daily Ledger wouldn't stop ringing. Nina's story had struck a nerve. Families, nurses, even hospital clerks were calling from all over the country. A woman from Alabama wrote, my father waited 3 hours for help with chest pain. He coded before they brought him in. His file said non-responsive too. A retired paramedic from Detroit said, we used Vital Rank at my old hospital. It tagged elderly patients as low risk just because they walked in. We called it the polite penalty. By Friday, Tasha's inbox had over 300 messages. She called Nina and said, you started something bigger than this hospital. Nina didn't smile. Good. Maybe now they'll listen. The story spread beyond local news. Major networks picked it up. Emergency bias, how hospital algorithms are choosing who waits. The non-responsive crisis, when AI fails to hear Black voices. One headline read simply, "The silence in the waiting room." When Eloise saw that one, she nodded slowly. "That's the one that hurts and heals all at once," she said. Hospitals across the state started scrambling to review their triage systems. Some paused the software entirely. Others quietly replaced it with manual oversight. But for many, the problem ran deeper. The code had already shaped the way staff thought. At Mercy Hills, where it all began, a nurse confided in Nina. "After the article, they told us to be careful what we say to the press. But off the record, that system's been making people wait for years. We just didn't have proof until you." Nina shook her head. "I didn't find the proof. The proof was already sitting in those waiting rooms." Soon, advocacy groups joined in. The National Council for Patient Equity launched a campaign called #HearTheBreath. It called for hospitals to ban the term non-responsive unless confirmed by a human examination. Videos poured in, elderly patients holding signs that read, "I'm breathing, I'm talking, I'm here." Eloise smiled when she saw them on TV. "Well," she said, "looks like I got company." A week later, the state health department announced an audit of every facility using VitalRank. The preliminary results were staggering. Nearly 18% of patients flagged low priority had conditions later deemed urgent or critical. And of those, 72% were Black, Latino, or elderly women. When Nina read the report, her chest tightened. 18%, she whispered. "That's not a glitch. That's a pattern." Eloise reached for her hand. And patterns can be unlearned. By the end of the month, hearings were scheduled at the state capitol. Nina was invited to testify alongside doctors, data scientists, and advocates. During the first session, one senator asked, "Do you believe the algorithm was biased?" Nina answered simply, "It's not about belief, it's about outcomes. If a system keeps hurting the same kind of people, it doesn't matter what it meant to do. It's biased by design." The room fell silent. That night, news anchors replayed her words. Commentators debated ethical AI and racial data bias. But to Nina, it wasn't theory. It was Tuesday nights in crowded waiting rooms, watching her mother gasp for air while a screen said she could wait. Eloise watched the coverage from her recliner, a blanket around her shoulders. "You know, I used to tell my students that silence is powerful when it's a choice," she said. "But when silence is forced, it's just neglect." Nina nodded. "And we're done being quiet." A few days later, Tasha called with breaking news. "Congress is taking this up," she said. "They're drafting a federal bill, something called the Emergency Fairness Act. It's based on your testimony." Nina froze. "Mine?" "Yours and your mom's," Tasha said. "They're using your words. Urgency must be heard, not inferred." Eloise laughed softly. "Well, baby, looks like the Lord found a use for my teacher voice after all." When silence spreads across thousands of lives, it stops being an accident. It becomes architecture. The non-responsive label didn't describe patience. It described a system that refused to listen. But this time, the waiting room talked back. That night, Nina opened her notebook again. They called it a model for efficiency. We turned it into a movement for empathy. She smiled and whispered, "Now let's finish the lesson." Next, Nina helped shape new reforms, policies built from her mother's story that ensure every emergency system must listen twice, once to the data and once to the person in front of it. 3 months later, Nina found herself sitting at a long wooden table under the bright lights of a state hearing room. In front of her sat a row of lawmakers, doctors, and health executives. Cameras hummed quietly in the back. The banner above read, "Public Hearing, Algorithmic Bias in Emergency Care." Her mother, Eloise, sat in the front row, wrapped in a navy shawl, her hands folded neatly. She gave Nina a small nod. The same look she used to give before a school recital, the kind that said, "You know what to do." Nina took a breath and began. "My name is Nina Grant. My mother walked into an emergency room breathing, but left marked as non-responsive. The system that made that call wasn't evil, it was just blind, and blindness is dangerous when it sits between a patient and a doctor." She held up a printed copy of Vital Rank's documentation. This is what decided her priority: a list of checkboxes and penalties for speaking slow, for coming after dark, for living in the wrong zip code. None of that measures pain, none of that measures humanity. The room was silent except for the quiet clicks of reporters' keyboards. A lawmaker leaned forward. "Miss Grant, what do you think should change?" Nina spoke clearly. "First, we need a law that requires human override in every automated triage system. If a nurse or family member says something's wrong, the computer has to stop and listen." She lifted another sheet. "Second, hospitals must disclose which factors affect priority. No more secret formulas deciding who gets help first. And finally, every patient should have the right to request a recheck if their symptoms worsen." She paused, letting the words settle, because no one should have to fight a machine to be heard. When it was Eloise's turn to speak, she stood slowly, the microphone catching the tremor in her voice.
"I'm not a computer expert," she said. "I'm just someone who couldn't breathe. But I remember sitting there, watching people walk past while that board kept flashing low priority. I kept thinking, maybe I should have shouted louder. But patients shouldn't have to shout to matter." Her words drew a quiet, collective sigh from the audience. One senator leaned toward the mic. "Mrs. Grant, if you could tell hospitals one thing, what would it be?" Eloise smiled softly. "Look up. Before you look down at that screen, look up. You might save a life." The hearing ended with applause, small at first, then rising until the room echoed. Outside, reporters crowded around them. "Miss Grant, how does it feel to start a national conversation?" one asked. Nina shook her head. "It's not national yet, not until every waiting room listens." A month later, the Emergency Fairness Act passed its first vote in committee. It required every ER in the state to follow 3 new standards. 1. Human override rule. Any staff member can escalate a patient regardless of triage score. 2. Recheck interval. All low-priority cases must be reassessed within 15 minutes. 3. Bias audit mandate. Every algorithm must be reviewed twice a year for racial, gender, and age bias. News outlets called it the Grant reforms. When Nina showed the article to her mother, Eloise laughed. "Lord, my name's on a law now? I was just trying to breathe." "And now," Nina said, smiling, "you're helping others do the same." Hospitals began to change their workflows. Posters appeared in ER lobbies across the state. "Hear the breath, not just the score." Staff training videos taught nurses to use technology as a tool, not a gatekeeper. At Mercy Hills, the triage system now flashed a new prompt for every patient over 65. Manual verification required. When Eloise returned for her follow-up, the triage nurse looked her in the eye and said, "Mrs. Grant, how are you feeling today?" Eloise smiled. "Better already. You looked up." Change didn't come from the company or the code. It came from the people who refused to stay quiet. The Grant reforms reminded hospitals that the first form of care isn't treatment, it's attention. That night, Nina wrote her final entry for the hearing record. Who can fix it? The people who still listen. How can they fix it? By remembering that silence is never consent. It's a symptom. She closed her notebook, glanced at her mother sleeping peacefully on the couch, and whispered, "We did it, Mama." Next, the story comes full circle, as Eloise returns to the same emergency room, not as a patient in pain, but as a guest speaker teaching nurses how to see what the machines still can't. 6 months later,
Eloise Grant stood once again in the same emergency room where everything had begun. But this time, she wasn't holding her chest, she was holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Grant?" a young nurse asked, smiling nervously. "You ready?" Eloise nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked together to the waiting area, now freshly painted and brighter than before. On one wall, a new poster hung in bold teal letters. "Hear the breath, not just the score." Below it, smaller words read, "The Grant Reforms, 2029. Every patient has the right to be heard." Eloise looked around at the full room, people coughing, pacing, cradling children. She felt a familiar tug in her chest, not pain this time, but recognition. "These are my people," she whispered. A nurse introduced her to the room. "Everyone, this is Mrs. Eloise Grant. She's here to share her story and remind us why we listen." Eloise smiled, leaning on her cane. "Even the smartest machine can't hear fear. That's why you can't let a blinking number tell you who matters first." She told them how she'd once sat in that same room, sweating and scared, watching the screen label her non-responsive, and how her daughter refused to let that be the last word. The crowd, patients and staff alike, listened in stillness. "I learned something," Eloise said softly. "You can't fix a system by shouting at it. You fix it by teaching it to see again, one nurse, one patient at a time." When she finished, there was quiet applause, not loud or showy, but the kind that comes from people who understand. Afterward, the hospital director came up to her, smiling awkwardly. "Mrs. Grant, I owe you an apology and a thank you. You changed how we do things here." Eloise chuckled. "You changed how you see things. That's even better."
He nodded. "We ran the numbers. ER mortality for seniors is down 12% since the new rule." Eloise smiled. "Guess we proved listening saves lives." That afternoon, as she sat outside on a bench waiting for Nina to pick her up, a young woman approached, a nurse trainee, barely in her 20s. "Mrs. Grant?" she said shyly. "My grandma's story was a lot like yours. She waited too long in another hospital. I joined this job because of what you did." Eloise's eyes softened. "Then you make sure no one else waits like she did." The young nurse nodded, teary-eyed. When Nina arrived, she found her mother staring up at the hospital's new digital display. It showed a quote, "Urgency must be heard, not inferred, in Grant." Nina laughed. "Well, look at that. They gave me a wall before I even turned 40. Eloise smiled proudly. "And they gave me the peace I was waiting for." They drove home with the windows down, the summer air warm and full of promise. That evening, Eloise sat at her kitchen table, the same spot where she had once written, "The bottle's empty, the app says wait." She opened a new notebook and began to write. "I used to think silence kept me safe. Now I know silence almost took me. Being heard isn't a privilege, it's the first step to healing." She underlined the last line twice. A week later, the national news featured her story once more. The reporter's voice played over footage of her smiling in the waiting room. The Grant reforms have now been adopted in 28 states. Hospitals nationwide are retraining staff to ensure every patient, especially seniors, receives human reassessment. Eloise watched the screen, sipping tea. "Imagine that," she said, "a law born from one long night." Nina smiled. "One long night that changed a lifetime of waiting." Eloise Grant didn't tear down the system, she retuned it. The machine still hums in every hospital, but now a human voice hums louder. Because urgency isn't data, it's the sound of someone asking to live. Every heartbeat deserves to be heard. The Grant Reforms, 2029. If this story spoke to you, share it. Someone you love might still be waiting for their turn to be heard. Subscribe to Older Black Person Stories, when data meets dignity, for more true stories about courage, care, and the power of being seen.